So we're going back about 20 years or so when I first started cutting stuff up and joining it back together again. I started out, as most people do, with nails and glue, and then I progressed to screws and glue, and then I bought a cheap little dowel jig. It wasn't particularly good. I wasn't very happy with the results from it, so I moved on from that. I tried a cheap biscuit jointer and that worked okay, and then I moved on from that and I ended up with a domino, and that worked pretty well for me for many years, and it still does. And I never really gave much thought to dowels after that, until fairly recently. I knew I had the idea for the Untitled Basics series. That's a series that's well worth watching if you haven't caught that yet. And I actually used a cheap little dowel jig, bought this one for 12 or 13 pounds off Amazon, and I used that for the first time on the lightweight trestles video, and I got some really good results out of it. And it wasn't until I actually used it on the Untitled Basics video that I realized that other than the color, this is almost identical to the cheap little dowel jig that I threw away because I didn't get good results from it 20 years ago. And it turns out, of course, that it wasn't the dowel jig that was the problem 20 years ago. It was me. I wasn't very good 20 years ago. I've got better at this, and in this video I'm just going to show you a few pointers to help you get the best from a cheap little jig like this. Now, whenever you get your hands on a little dowel jig for the first time, you start looking for instructions on this, and they invariably talk about three types of joint. There's an L joint, where you've got either the top or the base into a cabinet. There's a T joint, like you've got a fixed shelf in the side of a cabinet. And there's what they call a panel-to-panel joint, or a butt joint, where you just join two panels together. I'm only going to talk about the T joint and the L joint here, because to be perfectly honest, in 20 years of doing this for a living, you can count the number of panel-to-panel joints I've done on the thumb of one hand. Before we get into any of the T and L joints though, I need to repeat myself for a minute. I'm just going to mark up the face, side and edge before we do anything else. This is just generally good practice to do. I'm going to use the traditional markings. That's a funny little arrow on the edge and a squiggle that's actually a copperplate F for face on the face. And the face, side and edge are literally just the bits that face outwards. And it's important to know that, because you need to be able to reference off the right parts when you're using any kind of tool with a fence like this. There's one on the dowel jig, there's one on a domino, there's one on a lamello zeta, there's one on a biscuit jointer, and there's one on the peanut mini jig. Whenever you've got a fence like this, you need to know what you're referencing off, what the datum is, so that you can get things consistent. So there we are, face, side and edge marked. That's going to be the outside face and the top edge of our carcass. And obviously this is the side, so we want to be putting dowels onto the inside face. So the next thing we're going to do is make life easy for ourselves in the marking out. We're just going to use a sliding square to mark in from either edge. Now, you don't have to do this. You can just sort of put a pencil mark wherever you want, but it's generally good practice to get into being consistent in your marking in from the edge. So I'm just going to use a sliding square on this to go inside, and I'm just working off the inside face. And then we're just going to put one of these round about the center. Doesn't have to be exact. So with the face sides flat on the bench, we can now transfer those marks from one side to the other, and then extend them down along the edge. Alrighty, so we've got our boards all marked up. We know where the dowels are going. I want to get the fence set up on the dowel jig. Because this is the L joint, I'm not that bothered about the dowels being exactly centered in the board. On a T joint, maybe where you're putting a shelf and you want that shelf to be on the center line, that's a little bit more important. I'll show you another way of centering the dowels on the end of a board when we get to do the T joint. But for the L joint, I'm just setting the fence to about 9mm, because it's about an 18mm thick board, and because we're referencing off the fence off a face and an edge, it's always going to align. So I've done that bit, and I've set the depth stop on the drill bit to give us just a hair over 15mm showing. I'm using 8x30mm dowels, so I'm just a little bit more than 15mm showing, and I'm using 8x30s to make life easier for myself, because we can drill the same depth in the edge and the face of the boards without changing the stop. And I'm using a regular bit, not a brad point or lip and spur bit, because that little point can give us a few problems if we try and go too deep. I'm also going to run a quick test on this on a piece of scrap, partly to make sure that we're drilling deep enough, because there's nothing worse than you drilling your dowel holes, trying to assemble the joint, and having a little sliver where it won't quite meet because you haven't quite drilled deep enough. So I'm just going to test that now, and then we'll start drilling these out for real. So when it comes to putting a dowel into the face, we've got our lines all marked up here. One of the things I find particularly difficult is you get the fence all aligned okay, but actually lining up the jig against the pencil mark is really hard, because as soon as you get close to it you block out all the light. This is where one of our little brad point bits comes in handy, because you can get the brad point bit in there, you can put the fence flush up against the edge and drop the point of the bit down, bring it across until it's against your line, and then just bring the jig down onto it. And what I've found particularly useful is to actually just clamp the jig down as well, and then you can drill that through without any fear of the jig actually moving. I know almost all the jigs do come with a sort of a handle that you can sort of hand hold them, but you know, how many hands have you got? It's better in many ways to clamp that down if you can. It doesn't have to be a fancy clamp, it can be a little spring clamp, as long as it's big enough to go on there. That'll keep it sort of locked in tight just while you drill your holes. That makes a big difference. So, moment of truth time. Are they going to fit? Yeah, not bad. We can live with that. Okay, so T joint. We're going to do this slightly differently, less measuring and marking out. We're just going to give ourselves a centre line that we want the shelf to go up against, and then we're going to just give ourselves sort of arbitrary marks where we want the dowels to go. We're actually going to centre this one, and the way we do that, just pop this in on edge. We do need to take the fence off for this. That's what we need to do. These little legs on the back of the jig will automatically, depending on how they're arranged, will centre the jig, and I'm just going to put a little spring clamp on one of those legs just to help us along a little bit. And then we can just drill these through. And then we're going to pop 1, 2, 3 dowels in there. And then we can line this up against here. Our little jig has little notches cut out in the back of it, and our 8mm notch will line up against that dowel perfectly. And there are little marks on the side of the jig that show you where the centre is. So another sort of moment of truth moment, so no measuring or marking, just referenced off the dowels that we already drilled and fitted. And that should, there you go, all nicely referenced, nice and tight, minimal measuring and marking, just putting the dowels in where you wanted them to be into the end and then referencing off those, using this as a fence effectively. So there we are, two of the most common types of joint, a T-joint and an L-joint, all done with dowels that cost pennies, less than a penny each certainly, and a dowel jig that cost around 12 or 13 pounds. Last time I looked, you couldn't actually get this jig as a standalone piece, you had to get it as part of a kit, which meant you got drill bits and other things as well. Took the price up to around 16 or 17 pounds. If you've got the bits already, then you might want to consider spending the same kind of money on this one. It's a Wolfcraft jig. It's a little bit more workmanlike, and one of the main differences is you can take the fence off much more easily for those mid-panel fixings for the T-joint. So if that's something you're going to do, if you're going to be making cabinets with fixed shelves in, maybe consider this one instead. But I'll leave it there for this week, I think. I hope you enjoyed this quick dowel jig tips video. If you did, then give the video a big thumbs up or two, or leave me a comment down below if you'd like to see more like this. There are links in the video description to the products that I've shown here today, so be sure to take a look for additional information, but I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. As always, thanks so much to my Patreon pals and my YouTube members for their amazing support. If you'd like to be part of the conversation, part of the community that helps shape the content of these publicly facing videos, as well as getting access to behind the scenes and exclusive content, then come and join us as a Patreon supporter or YouTube member. We'd love to have you on board and taking part. While my member credits roll, I'll leave you with one more quick tip, so stay watching for that. But that's it for this week. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you next time. So one more quick tip before you go. This is if your OCD is starting to kick in and you have to use the fence on the dowel jig, but you absolutely must have that dowel centered in the board. What you do, you take a piece of scrap like this, you take your dowel jig with the fence off and the little pegs, and you center that. Love festival drills. Never done that before. So you take your dowel jig and you center the 8mm on your board or whatever you're using, and drill your hole. You pop a dowel in there and you pop the fence back on, and you put the jig over that dowel, and then you line the fence up. Tighten them up again. Obviously this is off your face, side and edge, and that is your dowel jig aligned and centered perfectly. Enjoy!